same magnitude of change, or do you think we will actually see more change in the world than we have seen? So I'm going to ask you to raise your hands. Those who think, by the way, it's perfectly reasonable, we've had an unbelievable 10 years. Those who think there will be less change in the next 10 years, please raise your hand. Must be someone. Okay, then perhaps we could hypothesize that change is relatively steady. So how about those who think it'll be about the same? About the same over the next 10 years. I mean, this is a reasonable possibility. Okay, well, I guess just to make sure you're listening, if you please raise your hands if you think we will see even more change in the next 10 than we have seen in the last 10. You in the back, what do you think? Okay, well, we have not just a majority, but complete unanimity, which is rare. Switching back. Okay. Let me say, Your Excellencies, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, young, amazing men and women, it is a great honor for me to be here with you today. And I would have to say, painfully, the subject of this talk really couldn't be more appropriate. Painful because of what's happening in the world right now. As you all have seen, as you all have heard, leaders are confronting a world in which the pace of change that they are seeing is beyond the scale of our institutions to keep up. It's an extremely difficult period, and we just simply struggle to keep pace with, sorry, the slides are not appearing, dear gentlemen. There we go. And this period is one of intense adaptive pressure. This is Charles Darwin, of course, and Charles Darwin taught us that periods of intense pressure, adaptive pressure, are of course the engines, the very engines of evolution. But that is a ruthless and difficult process. Those who cannot adapt fail. Those that can adapt to change, make use of it and thrive in it, of course, survive. And what is true of nature, we know is true of nations, it's true of businesses. This is the world that we live in. Now, the private sector has mechanisms of adaptation built in through market forces. But even, and especially the most successful private sector organizations themselves can become embedded in their inherited ways of doing things. And those who are still in their inherited ways of doing things and cannot adapt, they will fail. And we're seeing, as a consultant, I can tell you, we are seeing this manifest itself in spades. So, why? How do we understand this? We are in the midst of what historians call a critical juncture. Now, lately I've been hearing the phrase critical juncture bandied about quite a bit. It's actually a relatively formal construct of historians. Darren Acemoglu, for example, refers to it very often. It refers to a compressed period of time in which a disproportionate amount of structural change occurs. And critical junctures are, by their definition, intense periods of adaptive pressure. But they're not all negative, and something that really distresses me greatly, those who speak about the future that's coming, we tend to focus so much on the challenges and the threats and all that could go wrong. It is certainly true that we are watching an international order, not just that the institutions are decaying, we are seeing multilateral institutions being intentionally dismantled, intentionally disrupted. That's what makes this period so different. Human beings have built up institutional architectures over time. We're in a moment where those who have even built some of those architectures are dismantling them intentionally. That's very different. But on the other hand, and we haven't discussed it too much at this amazing event so far, the advances of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and this will accelerate with agentic AI and with world models, are also enabling a transformation of scientific discovery and knowledge creation. So we are on the cusp of a period when our ability to solve the most important problems in the world will be exponentially increased. That's not delusional Silicon Valley. I'm a Stanford guy, but I tell you that's just the fact. In fact, if you look at the Nobel Prize won by Demis Hassabis, he won it because of applying this technology to a domain of science where he and the DeepMind team exponentially accelerated the time it took to get to results in protein science that was previously possible. So this is not science fiction. So that's very important. We are in the midst of a critical juncture, and critical junctures create decision points. Well, what are decision points? A critical decision point, the phrase emerges from the military, are moments in space and time when a leader must make a decision, allocate resources, or take action in the context of rapid change. Well, Germany entered 2022 facing a deep structural exposure to Russian pipeline gas. When those flows were curtailed at the beginning of the Ukraine war, it had very, very few options, and the options that it had were extremely costly. It had fallen into a structural concentration on Russian gas. This was a function of contracts, but it was also a function of pipelines. So there was an infrastructural lock-in to Germany's position at that time. 55% of their gas, 35% of their oil, and 45% of their coal came from Russia. And then the shock occurred. By the way, to make matters worse, they had not that long before decided to curtail nuclear power for environmental reasons following Fukushima. And so when the shock occurred, they were in a state of extreme dependency. First, Russian flows were curtailed. Then, as you know, 2 of the pipelines were sabotaged. As a result, Uniper, their largest energy company, collapsed. It had to be nationalized by the German government. And energy-intensive industries in Germany, remember, it's an industrial powerhouse, were severely hurt by this. Some had to relocate. They had to reduce production. Ultimately, the European Union did find a resolution, but it was at enormous, enormous expense. Germany launched a $200 billion euro protective shield, which was very effective. They bought time, but at a massive, massive cost, in which industrial capacity was lost, of course. Now, to Germany, as a proud German American, I say, to Germany's credit, they built an LNG, a floating LNG facility, a terminal, in record time, in 200 days, something that normally should take 3 years. Germany did it in 200 days, something about which they should be proud. But the fact is, this crisis response, it shouldn't have taken a crisis to unlock that speed. And so the key lesson is that Germany found itself facing a critical decision point in which it lacked options. And remember, it didn't just lack options for its energy security. Because of it, it lost geostrategic leverage in the most existential crisis that Europe and therefore Germany has faced, which was the invasion of Ukraine. And so it was vulnerable. So the cost of not having optionality is measured in billions, and many times it's measured in lives, but for countries, it's also measured in sovereignty. And we'll return to that in just a moment. So that brings us to, what do we mean by strategic optionality? Strategic optionality refers to the extent that a decision maker, that an organization, that a leader, facing a specific circumstance, has viable options at their disposal to respond. So Germany is a superb example of a moment when they had almost no optionality. Optionality refers to how many viable choices do you have. That's the essence of what it means. It's the ability then, because of having options, to adapt more quickly and to keep up with the pace of change in real time because one is ready. And so to understand its importance, it's critical to understand the relationship between leverage and time. When you are ready for a significant change, when you have the capabilities you need to respond ahead of time, you can shape how events unfold. When you're not ready, when the response is therefore delayed, you lose leverage and you incur costs. This idea has its roots deep in the literature of strategy, of which is so important to me in my career, as you can imagine. But even going back to Clausewitz. Clausewitz, who famously said, war is the province of uncertainty. I think in Iran, we're all seeing that right now, all too clearly and painfully. It is not only the province of uncertainty, however, it's also the province where what he called branches, sequences, and reserves are so absolutely critical. Similarly, the great master of strategy, Sun Tzu, famously said that the essence is, of course, to not allow the enemy's will to be imposed upon you. And this is itself about building optionality. Sir Lawrence Friedman, the great Sir Lawrence Friedman, speaks about strategy as creating power, doing more with the balance of power in a given moment than is made possible by its sheer logic. Strategy transforms the equation of power relations to create power. Optionality is central to that. And I've learned that Chanakya, in the Arthashastra, illuminated this idea with exquisite beauty, of course, in the Indian tradition. So many of the most brilliant and important ideas we find deeply embedded in Indian culture, of course, and that was the case here. So, by anticipating future circumstances, by anticipating the choices that our leaders might have to make, by understanding the options we would want them to have when facing that choice, and then building the capabilities that they would need to respond, we are creating optionality. So how do we do it? It begins, of course, by understanding the baseline strategy. I took here an example for your benefit of food security. So the process begins by first understanding the intent. Where are we? What is our desired end state? And what is the central course of action by which we will achieve it? That is the starting point, of course. And, of course, optionality without intentionality is just pure chaos, pure optionality with no direction. But direction without optionality is rigidity. It's brittleness. It is what breaks when the world changes. I'm grateful to see a brilliant woman in this table who understands what I'm saying. I want to thank you for that. You need that. So I hope you're able to follow this. Okay, let's move on. So when then we encounter change, whether those change are structural shifts that have passed a certain threshold, so big patterns of change where a threshold has been crossed, requiring us to make a decision, or a strategic shock, a specific event. We're in the midst of yet another one right now. These are the things that require us to then say, given the baseline, how might we have to adapt? That's what these lines of this eye-shaped visual represent. And when that occurs, we will face a decision point. The essence of this approach is to anticipate those shocks. And so once you anticipate them and you understand the pathway, the alternative pathway that they would require, should they occur, that's not enough, of course. The next step is to understand the options that we would want to have in response. And so this is a representation of 3 options that we would want to have with respect to our food security strategy if extreme weather events passed a certain threshold. But of course, knowing the options we would want is itself, needless to say, also not enough. We need the capabilities to respond. What do we call it? A dynamic engine. And this methodology we developed in partnership with the Prime Minister's Office of the amazing United Arab Emirates, a beautiful country that was my home for 10 years and is still a home of my heart, and for whom we are praying these days because they are under incredible duress. I hope you'll all join me in keeping them in your thoughts and prayers, that beautiful and amazing country. A dynamic engine is a constellation of capabilities that allows you to do something, to achieve an intentional outcome in changing circumstances. It's the substance of strategy. You are, in any given moment in time, you are either enabled or constrained by the capabilities that you have. And so once you understand the options that you would like, you then find the capabilities that you would need to respond. But of course, you cannot build all of them. And so, and by the way, this methodology requires artificial intelligence, of course. Once you understand that universe, you have to optimize for what are those capabilities that create most optionality across the broadest range of circumstances. And so this then is what a plan looks like that has baked in optionality. It is responsive, it is living, it is adaptive. It is crystal clear on its intent, but has baked optionality in. And doing this in a world like the one we're in is not just about resilience. No, no, no. It is about sovereignty. Because if you have strengthened this capability, you have effectively strengthened national sovereignty. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Rudolph Lohmeyer III, of course, addressing us there. And thank you also for your appreciation for me earlier as well. Okay, well, we are going to be pausing for a second our conversations to just quickly take a moment to thank those without whom NXT 2026 would not have been possible. Our partners, sponsors, Adani, SPS Construction India Private Limited, session partners, ACE Group, Bhutani, BLS,